Welcome back to another Sabbath School lesson. This is going to be lesson number 11, coming to you live from Canada. They actually speak French here as a prime language, not English. I thought it was English and French. It's French because the brother's struggling right now. But that's beside the point. The point is the Sabbath School lesson, lesson 11, and we're starting out with waiting in the crucible, waiting in the crucible. The memory verse this time is going to be from Galatians chapter 5 and verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is long-suffering. But the fruit of the Spirit is long-suffering. So for this lesson, the main theme that the author's trying to get across is really lessons while waiting for God. These are lessons while waiting for God, or basically lessons from waiting from God. We'll probably break this lesson out into two main points to summarize, and then one profound meditation. So let's get into it. The first general point that we want to pay attention to here that the author kind of gets to, and he has several things, but basically he's trying to give you reasons for why you wait on God. I kind of condensed these into about 4 general categories. So basically, I think that you can kind of see this through the lens of looking at the Israelites. So let me give you an idea of what this means. The first point is refocus our attention back on God. This is a reason why we wait on God. Number 2 is going to be to develop a clear picture of our own motives and desires. So the Israelites are basically going from Egypt to the Promised Land, and there's this waiting period that they're going through between the time that they get to the Promised Land and the time that they leave Egypt. And basically the main idea here is that God is also allowing certain crucibles or trials to hit them to, number 1, bring their attention back to them, or bring their attention back to Him. One of the key things is that even though Israel left Egypt, Egypt didn't leave Israel. And so God is trying to get their mindsets right as they're on their way to the Promised Land. So this is one of the big lessons as you see Israel kind of going through different trials, tribulations, struggles, because God is trying to refocus their mind back on Him and teach them how to get Egypt out of themselves. The last 2 points to review that the author kind of brings out here is that it builds spiritual strengths like perseverance, faith, and trust. And number 4, it allows God to put down other pieces in the puzzle of the bigger picture. So what 3 and 4 here, points 3 and 4 basically are kind of bringing out is that many times we end up waiting in a crucible or waiting in a trial because God is actually trying to work on our character development, building perseverance or building faith. These type of things, just like the Israelites, as they're going through trials, they have the opportunity to learn how to have faith and trust in God to deliver the food that they need or to deliver the water that they need. So they were made to be starving or very hungry, and then to figure out, like, what do I do when I'm in a situation and I don't have what I need? Now they have to learn to depend on God. So it's character development. But at the same time, God is showing them that there are certain things that I need basically to put down in place before you actually make it to the Promised Land. These things would be stuff like you need to first make a covenant with God and, keep His commandments. That covenant keeping people analogy that happens around Exodus chapter 19 and Exodus chapter 20. Mainly because if they go into the Promised Land and they haven't made a commitment to God, well then what do they rely on when they're actually there in the Promised Land? Who's going to actually support them in their time of need? But it's not about going to a land, it's about following God wherever you go. So we wait in the crucibles because there's often times that we need to, that God needs to place some things in order before we actually get to our destination. The next key landmark point is going to be basically the compare and contrast of the story of David and also the story of Elijah. So David is the story in 1 Samuel chapter 26, and Elijah is the story in 1 Kings chapter 18. Going into chapter 19, it's really basically 1 Kings 19 verse 1 through 9, but if you need the background, read chapter 18 as well. So basically the story of David is running away from Saul because Saul is against him and he's trying to kill him because Saul is jealous that the kingship is about to go to David, and he's also jealous that God has shown David favor and now he wants to go out and kill David, right? And so basically David comes in and he has a chance to kill Saul. He gets very close to him while Saul is sleeping, cuts off a piece of his garment, and basically moves away from them, wakes him up. And once he wakes up, he basically shows him this piece of the garment saying, hey, I got this close to you, but I'm not actually meaning to do harm to you. It's a very valuable lesson here because David didn't rush out even though he's in the midst of this great trial, he could have rushed out and killed Saul and got rid of his trial. But instead, he chooses to wait on God and says, I'm going to let God take this. I'm not going to put my hand up against the Lord's anointed. So that's the one thing that the author points out here. The other aspect is that Elijah is in the story, and he basically has this Mount Carmel experience in which there's a huge revival. Fire comes down from heaven. Afterward, everybody basically knows Jezebel ends up saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to kill you because you killed my prophets. And because of this, Elijah freaks out and he runs off into the wilderness because he's super basically scared of Jezebel, right? And basically the author is comparing and contrasting and saying, listen, like David waited on God in the midst of a trial, but the moment that Elijah is hit with the trial, he runs away. And so the idea here that the author wants to bring out is simply this. In an attempt to escape pain, we often rush ahead of God. In an attempt to escape pain, we often rush ahead of God. And so it's a question also to ask yourself, that is, if there's any pain in your life, pain point that you're hitting on, that maybe it's pushing you to act out and rush a little bit further ahead of God. Now here's the profound meditation. One thing the author points out on Friday is a quote from Ellen G. White from Selected Messages, Book 2, page 242. It says, the Lord is not pleased to have us fret and worry ourselves out of the arms of Jesus. And here's the main point. You can worry yourself into doing harm to yourself or to others. You can worry yourself into doing harm to yourself or others. So here's one of the unique stories that is like a legendary story from a long time ago. And you might have heard this story before. But basically, it's an old story of a monk and a merchant. And basically, the monk and the merchant are friends. But what ends up happening is, as they are kind of growing up and the monk kind of finds his way, and the merchant finds his way, they get very high statuses in their own respects. One in the church and one in the business world. And they still somewhat became, kind of remained friends over a period of time. But the monk gets this idea that his friend, who's now amassed millions and millions of dollars in his business, he's losing sight of God. And so he wants to convince him that he needs to repent and come to God, even though he shows up to church often and tries to say he's giving his heart to God. The monk feels like he needs to go further. And so basically he preaches every single weekend about the story of the rich young ruler, basically saying when Jesus told the rich young ruler, sell everything that you have, give away everything that you have, and basically come follow me, right? And so that idea is something that the monk really wanted to press on his friend, the merchant. And even though he keeps pressing, the friend isn't really giving in, and eventually it starts to rub the friend the wrong way, that he ends up saying, hey, you know what, I don't need this, and he fully just walks away from the church, like totally, completely. And one of the key lessons that we can take from the story is that sometimes we worry so much about the right thing happening that we end up doing the wrong thing and causing harm to others. We worry so much about the right thing happening that we end up doing the wrong thing and causing harm to others. And even though this monk was trying to do the right thing and trying to basically witness to his friend, trying to show some sort of compassion to bring his friend back, it seems like he started pushing too hard and he started to do the work of ultimately God. And how often do we end up doing the work of God because we're trying to step out on a limb and we're so concerned about a topic? Maybe we're concerned about our finances, and so, or we end up getting a second or third job that maybe we shouldn't have gotten, and it ends up taking away from our family. And now we don't have a relationship very good inside of our family. But then you're like, oh, well, I was stressed out about the finances. And like maybe you might be stressed out about the finances. But the question is, did you move ahead of God to do that? That's the question. Maybe God wanted you to do that, but make sure that he actually wanted you to do that. Don't rush ahead of him and do something like that. So many times, that's just an example, by the way, not saying that people that do that, it's a bad thing. But the idea is that, are you rushing ahead of God to do something just because you're worried or concerned about something? You can actually end up hurting people physically, emotionally, and also spiritually because we end up rushing ahead of God. So here's the question for you today. What are you worrying about that is causing harm to yourself or others? What are you worrying about that is causing harm to yourself or others? I'm Oswald, and this is Profound Meditations, Sabbath School Summary.